All right, so let's jump right into this deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at a really interesting book. It's called Female Supremacy, The Hijacking of Society by Connie Riker.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And, you were particularly interested in how this whole idea of female supremacy kind of connects to these covert contracts and the historical shifts we've seen in our institutions.
Right.
So, I think Riker's approach is pretty direct.
Yeah, it seems like it.
She's very upfront about being a woman standing on the front lines of female supremacism.
Wow. Okay, so she's not pulling any punches.
No, she's not mincing words.
Okay.
And she really tries to, lay bare how these female supremacists, as she calls them, have supposedly infiltrated and manipulated these structures that we often take for granted. Social services, religion, even the legal system and the workplace.
That's a pretty bold claim.
Yeah, it is. It's a big claim.
So where does she even begin?
What's fascinating how she links this to the evolution of feminism.
Right.
Riker argues that the movement itself, maybe unintentionally, kind of paved the way for this female supremacy ideology.
So she's not saying feminism is inherently bad.
Right. She's saying that there were some unintended consequences.
Okay, interesting.
So she takes us all the way back to the suffragettes in England.
Oh, wow. Okay.
A powerful movement, obviously. But she claims that it unintentionally laid the groundwork for what she sees as a kind of power grab. Right?
So she's going way back in history.
Yeah, she's looking at the historical roots of this. And then she points to the backlash against feminism in the 60s and 70s.
Oh, right.
And she argues that this created a breeding ground for this new ideology to take hold.
It's like a pendulum swing, almost.
Yeah, exactly.
Interesting.
And she doesn't stop there. She suggests that things like political correctness and what she calls cultural Marxism in the 80s and 90s really fanned the flames.
Cultural Marxism, I'm not sure I'm familiar with that term.
Yeah, it's a bit loaded, right?
Okay.
Essentially, she's using it to describe what she sees as this pervasive left-leaning ideology that's like trying to overturn traditional values and power structures.
So not actual economic Marxism, but more of a cultural shift she sees as harmful?
Exactly.
Okay, I see. So is this just limited to England, or?
Well, that's the thing. She claims this female supremacy, as she sees it, is global. She describes it as an unseen empire working to, and I'm quoting her here, subjugate males and dismantle traditional male roles and spaces.
Wow, okay. That's a pretty sweeping statement.
It is, right. It makes you kind of stop and think, okay, how much of this is grounded in actual historical fact versus Riker's interpretation of those events?
Right. That's crucial to keep in mind. We're trying to understand her perspective, not necessarily endorse it.
Right. It's about understanding how she builds her case.
Exactly.
And one of the ways she does that is by focusing on what she calls the takeover of social services in England by these so-called female supremacists.
That's a loaded term for sure. But how does she back that up?
Well, she uses some pretty stark statistics.
Okay.
For example, Riker points out that women make up roughly 70% of social service workers in England.
70%? That's a significant number.
Right. And her argument is that this isn't just some coincidence, it's a calculated strategy.
So she's suggesting that those policies aimed at gender equality, especially those from the early 2000s, have been sort of hijacked and used to place women in positions of power.
Exactly.
Okay, I see where she's going with this. So how does this supposed takeover actually play out, according to her?
Well, that's where things get even more interesting. She introduces this concept of double binds as a tactic supposedly used by these female supremacists.
Double binds? What does she mean by that?
She even gives specific examples. One she uses is the expectation for men to be both strong and vulnerable.
Right, which can feel like a no-win situation.
Exactly. It's like you're damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Okay, I get it. So how does she connect that to this larger idea of female supremacy?
Well, Riker then connects this to the idea of toxic masculinity, arguing that these double binds are deliberately designed to make men feel guilty, ashamed, and ultimately psychologically distressed.
So it's a form of manipulation in her view.
Exactly.
And she's saying it's pervasive in our society.
Right. And it's not just social services. She applies this lens to religion as well.
Oh, wow. Okay, so how does that work?
She claims that feminist theologians have essentially twisted religious narratives to fit their agenda, portraying women as these holy, virtuous beings, while men are painted as sinners and oppressors.
That's a pretty bold statement. Does she give any specific examples?
Oh, she does. She uses historical figures to back this up. Millicent Fawcett, the British suffragist, is one example she cites. She's claiming Fawcett used her position within religious organizations to advance what Riker sees as a female supremacy agenda.
Okay, so she's using historical figures to support her claims. Interesting.
Yeah. And then she takes it even further when she starts talking about the education system in England. She basically argues that boys are being indoctrinated with this female supremacist ideology from a very young age.
Wow. Okay, this is getting pretty intense. So she's seeing this female supremacist ideology as this kind of invisible force shaping everything, from what kids learn in school to how men and women interact in the workplace.
That seems like it, yeah.
And that leads us right into her claims about the media, right?
Exactly.
Because she doesn't hold back there either. She criticizes major outlets like the BBC, Channel 4, and The Guardian for, allegedly pushing a feminist agenda.
Right. She argues that media coverage often downplays male victims and emphasizes female victims.
And I'm guessing she also brings up social media and how that plays into all of this.
Oh, absolutely. She even points to social media algorithms and how the constant chase for engagement online contributes to the spread of what she calls female supremacist narratives.
Right, because those algorithms are designed to keep us hooked, and controversial content often gets more attention.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And she uses examples from movies and TV shows, highlighting how women are often portrayed as strong and independent, while men are often relegated to these less flattering roles.
So she's painting a picture of how this ideology supposedly works behind the scenes to shape our perceptions of gender.
It seems like it, yeah.
Okay, so we've covered social services, religion, education, and the media. What's next on Riker's list?
Well, she argues that this alleged bias extends to the legal system as well.
Oh, boy. I bet she has a lot to say about that.
Oh, she does. And it's pretty intense.
All right, well, let's dive into that and see what she has to say.
Okay, so Riker claims that laws like the Equal Pay Act and laws concerning divorce and child custody actually disadvantage men.
Really? Those laws were designed to promote equality, weren't they?
That's the irony, right?
Okay, I'm curious to hear how she spins this.
Well, she goes as far as to claim that men are often given harsher sentences than women for similar crimes.
Wow. Okay, she's not holding back.
No, she's not. She's also very critical of the tender years doctrine in child custody cases, arguing that it unfairly favors mothers.
Right, that doctrine basically presumes that young children are better off with their mothers.
Exactly, which Riker sees as inherently biased against fathers.
Okay, I see. So she's tying all of this back to her central argument about female supremacy. She's suggesting that this supposed bias in the legal system is just another way this ideology is playing out in society.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And next, she brings it all back to the workplace.
Of course, because that's where a lot of these gender dynamics really come into play.
Exactly. And she introduces this concept of the glass cliff, which she argues is a subtle form of discrimination against women. Basically, she's saying they're promoted to leadership roles during times of crisis, almost setting them up to fail.
Oh, I've heard of that.
Yeah.
The idea is that it reinforces the stereotype that women aren't as effective as men in leadership positions. Right. It's like a no-win situation for women.
Exactly. And she also critiques the quota system, arguing that it often results in qualified men being passed over for promotions simply to meet those quotas.
Right, regardless of their actual skills or experience. Does she give any examples of this?
She does. She uses the case of Jill Abramson at the New York Times.
Oh, right. I remember that.
She uses Abramson's appointment and subsequent firing as evidence of this glass cliff phenomenon at work.
So it seems like her goal is to connect all these different dots, from social services to education to the legal system to the workplace, to reveal this overarching pattern of female supremacy at play in society.
Exactly. And that leads us to one of the most thought-provoking parts of her book.
Okay, which is?
The concept of male dispossession.
Male dispossession. What does that mean?
She's arguing that men are being marginalized and disenfranchised in a society that increasingly favors women.
So she's painting a picture of men feeling lost and powerless in a world that's rapidly changing around them.
Yes, and this is where she starts to offer some potential solutions, or at least strategies, for men to resist what she sees as this tide of female supremacy.
Okay, I'm really interested to hear what she proposes.
All right, let's dive into those strategies and see what Riker suggests.
So she suggests things like forming support groups.
Okay.
Where men can connect, share their experiences, and kind of find strength in collective action.
Right, finding that solidarity.
Exactly. And she also She also encourages men to challenge those media narratives we discussed,
Right.
be more vocal about the injustices they feel they face.
What's about men finding their voice and pushing back against this perceived imbalance?
Exactly. And she's a strong advocate for legal action as well. She believes men need to be more proactive in defending their rights and challenging discriminatory practices, whether that's in the workplace, family court, or elsewhere.
Yeah, so it sounds like she's issuing a call to action, urging men to stand up, fight back, and reclaim their place in a society that she believes has shifted too far in the other direction.
That's one way to interpret it, yeah. But what's really interesting is that she also suggests that men need to focus on self-improvement.
Oh, okay. So it's not just about fighting the system.
Right. She encourages them to prioritize their physical and mental health, develop their skills and talents, and ultimately become more well-rounded
It's
individuals.
not just about fighting external battles, but also about men looking inward and taking responsibility for their own growth.
Right. It's like she's saying that men need to become the best versions of themselves, not just to compete in a world that she believes, increasingly favors women, but to thrive as individuals regardless of the societal challenges they face.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack there in terms of Riker's proposed solutions. But before we get into that, I'm curious to hear more about how she sees this female supremacy playing out in different areas of life. We touched on social services earlier, but she also talks about how it affects men in their personal relationships, right?
Absolutely. Riker argues that female supremacy isn't just about institutional power. It also manifests in the dynamics between men and women in their everyday lives.
Right.
And one of the key ways she sees this playing out is through these covert contracts you mentioned earlier.
Right. The listener specifically wanted to explore that concept.
Mm.
So how does Riker define these covert contracts, and what role do they play in her overall argument?
Well, she describes them as these unspoken agreements or expectations within relationships that often disadvantage men.
Okay.
These contracts, according to Riker, are often based on traditional gender roles and expectations,
Right.
but they've been twisted in a way that benefits women at the expense of men.
So can you give some specific examples of what these covert contracts might look like in a relationship?
Sure. Riker uses the example of a man being expected to be the primary breadwinner,
Okay.
even if his partner also works.
Right.
She argues that this expectation, even if it's not explicitly stated, can create a sense of financial burden and pressure on men. It also, in her view, reinforces the idea that men's worth is primarily tied to their ability to provide financially.
That's interesting. So even if a couple decides that both partners will work, there might still be this underlying expectation,
Right.
this covert contract that the man should be earning more or taking on more financial responsibility.
Exactly. And Riker argues that this can lead to resentment and conflict within relationships, especially if the man feels like he's constantly being held to a different standard than his partner.
She also talks about how these covert contracts can play out in terms of housework and childcare,
Yeah.
right?
Yes, that's another big one. Riker argues that even in relationships where both partners work full-time, women often still expect men to do a disproportionate share of the housework and childcare.
It's like there's this unspoken assumption that those tasks are primarily the woman's domain, even if she's also contributing equally to the household income.
Exactly. And Riker argues that this can lead to feelings of exhaustion and resentment on both sides. Men might feel like they're never doing enough around the house, while women might feel like they're constantly having to nag or remind their partners to help out.
So in Riker's view, these covert contracts are a way that female supremacy manifests itself in the day-to-day lives of men and women,
Right.
creating these subtle imbalances that can ultimately undermine relationships.
That's a good summary. And she connects this back to her overall argument about how female supremacy has seeped into various institutions,
Right.
creating a system that she believes disadvantages men on multiple levels.
Okay, so we've got these covert contracts operating relationships. And we've touched on how this supposed female supremacy is impacting social services. But what about religion? Riker has some pretty strong opinions about how that plays into all of this, right?
She does. Riker argues that religion has played a significant role in promoting what she sees as female supremacy throughout history, and that it continues to do so today.
You mentioned earlier that she believes feminist theologians have hijacked religious narratives. Can
Right.
you elaborate on that?
Sure. Riker argues that these theologians have reinterpreted religious texts and teachings to fit what she calls a misandrist agenda,
Okay.
emphasizing the virtues and accomplishments of women while downplaying the roles and contributions of men.
So she's saying that they're essentially twisting religious narratives to fit a specific ideological perspective.
Right. And she uses specific examples to support this claim. We talked about Millicent Fawcett earlier, the British suffragist. Riker argues that Fawcett used her position within the Quaker religion to advocate for women's rights and ultimately contribute to what she sees as the rise of female supremacy. She also points to other historical figures and movements within various religions that she believes have contributed to this trend.
Riker also takes issue with how men and women are often portrayed in religious stories and teachings, right?
Yes, she argues that women are often depicted as pure, virtuous beings, while men are often portrayed as the villains of the story, sinners, abusers, oppressors.
So in her view, these portrayals contribute to this idea of women being inherently morally superior to men, which then feeds into this larger narrative of female supremacy.
Exactly. And she argues that this has real-world consequences, impacting everything from how men and women are treated in religious communities to how they view themselves and each other.
It's interesting how she connects this back to her overall argument about how female supremacy operates on multiple levels, from the personal to the institutional.
Mhm.
So we've got religion, social services, and then there's the education system, which Riker also sees as a breeding ground for this ideology, right?
Right. Riker argues that the education system, particularly in Western societies, has become increasingly feminized, and that this has had a negative impact on boys.
What specifically does she mean by feminized?
She argues that the curriculum, the teaching methods, even the physical environment of schools are often geared towards girls' learning styles and preferences, leaving boys feeling alienated and disengaged.
So it's not just about the content being taught, but the overall approach to education.
Exactly. Riker also argues that boys are often unfairly disciplined in schools, punished more harshly than girls for similar infractions. She even claims that there's a deliberate effort to undermine traditional masculinity in schools, portraying boys as inherently problematic or even dangerous.
He even claims.
Yeah. And she links this back to the concept of toxic masculinity, which we discussed earlier. She argues that schools are increasingly teaching boys to suppress their natural instincts and behaviors, leading to a generation of men who are emotionally stunted and disconnected from their own identities.
It's a pretty bleak picture she's painting of the education system. And it's interesting how she connects all of this back to her overall argument about female supremacy, arguing that it's another way that men are being systematically disadvantaged in society.
Yes. And she sees this as having long-term consequences, not just for individual men, but for society as a whole. She argues that by undermining traditional masculinity and failing to adequately educate boys, we're creating a generation of men who are ill-equipped to be successful partners, fathers, and members of society.
Okay, so we've covered religion, education, and social services. But Riker also goes into great detail about how she sees this female supremacy playing out in the media, right?
Absolutely. She's particularly critical of mainstream media outlets, arguing that they actively promote a feminist agenda that often portrays women as victims and men as perpetrators.
We touched on this earlier, but can you give some specific examples of how she sees this bias manifesting in media coverage?
Sure. Riker points to how cases of domestic violence are often reported,
Okay.
arguing that the media tends to focus on male perpetrators and female victims. Even though studies show that domestic violence is often perpetrated by both men and women, she also criticizes the way sexual assault allegations are covered, arguing that the media often rushes to judgment, portraying accused men as guilty before they've had a chance to defend themselves.
So she's saying that the media often presents a one-sided view of these issues, reinforcing negative stereotypes about men and contributing to a climate of fear and distrust.
Exactly, and she argues that this bias extends beyond news coverage to entertainment media as well. She points to the prevalence of strong, independent female characters in movies and TV shows, while male characters are often portrayed as bumbling, incompetent, or even villainous.
So she's saying that popular culture is also playing a role in shaping our perceptions of gender. and reinforcing this idea of female supremacy.
Right. And she sees this as having a profound impact on how men and women view themselves and each other. She argues that by constantly bombarding us with these one-sided portrayals, the media is contributing to a culture where men are increasingly seen as expendable or even dangerous, while women are seen as inherently virtuous and deserving of special treatment.
It's a pretty bleak picture she's painting of the media landscape. But she also acknowledges that there are alternative media outlets out there that offer a different perspective, right?
Yes, she does. Riker praises these alternative outlets for providing a platform for voices that challenge the dominant feminist narrative and offer a more balanced view of gender issues.
She sees these alternative outlets as a vital tool in the fight against what she calls female supremacy, offering men a space to share their experiences and perspectives without fear of censorship or ridicule.
Exactly. And she encourages men to seek out these alternative sources of information and to be more critical of the messages they're being fed by mainstream media.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, from covert contracts and relationships to the supposed female supremacy in religion, education, and the media. And next, I think we should delve into what she considers the most blatant example of this bias, the legal system.
Right. Riker argues that the legal system is inherently biased against men, from divorce and child custody laws to sentencing guidelines for criminal offenses. She sees this as the most concrete example of how female supremacy is playing out in society, with real-world consequences for men's lives and livelihoods.
All right, let's unpack that further and explore her arguments about the legal system.
Well, she's particularly passionate about how divorce and child custody laws often seem to favor women. She believes they put men at a disadvantage, both financially and in terms of their relationship with their children.
Right, so she's saying that the legal system is actually contributing to this male dispossession that she talks about.
Exactly. And she uses the example of alimony and child support payments, arguing that these laws often place an unfair financial burden on men, even in situations where both partners have, similar earning potential. She claims the system often leans towards assuming the man will be the one paying.
It's like the system is still operating on these outdated assumptions about men being the primary breadwinners, even when that's not the reality anymore.
Right. And she's highly critical of what's called the tender years doctrine in child custody cases.
Oh, right, I've heard of that.
This doctrine, which is still influential in many courts, basically presumes that young children are better off with their mothers, even in cases where fathers are equally capable of providing care. Riker sees this as inherently biased against fathers.
It sounds like she's saying that the legal system often operates on these outdated assumptions about gender roles,
Yeah.
assuming the woman is naturally more suited to be the primary caregiver,
Yeah.
even if that doesn't reflect the reality of the family situation.
Exactly. And Riker takes it a step further, claiming that men are often given harsher sentences than women for similar crimes.
Oh, wow.
This, in her view, points to a broader pattern of bias against men within the legal system.
So it's not just about the laws themselves. She's also talking about how those laws are applied and enforced, adding another layer to this perceived bias against men.
Absolutely. And, she brings up the issue of false accusations of sexual assault and domestic violence.
Right.
She argues that these accusations are often taken at face value, even when there's little or no evidence to support them.
It's like the believe all women movement taken to an extreme.
Right. And she believes this creates a climate of fear and distrust, where men are presumed guilty until proven innocent.
So in her view, the legal system not only has biased laws, but also a biased culture that makes it difficult for men to get a fair shake, even when they're innocent.
Exactly. And Riker connects this perceived legal bias to larger societal trends that she finds troubling, like the higher suicide rates among men, the increasing number of men who are homeless or living in poverty, and even the decline in male enrollment in higher education.
So she's arguing that these societal trends are, at least in part, a result of a legal system that stacks the deck against men and reinforces the idea that women are inherently superior.
That's a fair assessment of her argument. Whether you agree with her conclusions or not, it's clear she sees the legal system as a key battleground in this larger fight against what she calls female supremacy.
Okay, so we've talked about Riker's views on the legal system, and it's definitely a lot to process. But she doesn't just leave us with a bleak outlook, right? She also offers some potential solutions, or at least some strategies for men to navigate what she sees as a hostile environment.
That's right. Riker believes men need to become more aware of the ways in which they're being disadvantaged and then take action to protect themselves.
What kind of action does she suggest?
Well, she talks about the importance of men forming support groups, sharing their experiences and finding strength in collective action. She also encourages men to challenge the media narratives that often portray them in a negative light and to be more vocal about the injustices they feel they face.
So it's about men finding their voice, building a sense of community, and pushing back against a system they perceive as unfair.
Exactly. And as we mentioned earlier, she's a strong advocate for legal action. She believes men need to be more proactive in defending their rights and challenging discriminatory practices in court.
But it's not all about fighting external battles, is it? Riker also emphasizes the importance of self-improvement, right?
Absolutely. She encourages men to focus on their physical and mental health, develop their skills and talents, and generally work on becoming more well-rounded individuals.
It sounds like she's saying that regardless of the societal challenges men face, they should focus on becoming the best versions of themselves. That personal growth is essential, even if it doesn't immediately change the system.
That's a good way to put it. Riker's message is complex. It's a mix of calls to action on a societal level, coupled with an emphasis on individual responsibility and self-improvement.
It's definitely a lot to digest.
Yeah.
And she doesn't stop there, right? She goes on to speculate about the future, painting both utopian and dystopian possibilities.
That's right. In her utopian vision, women have achieved true equality, not just legally, but in all aspects of society. Gender roles become more fluid, and both men and women are free to pursue their passions and live fulfilling lives without being limited by traditional expectations.
It sounds like a future where everyone benefits from greater flexibility and understanding.
Yes, but she contrasts that with a darker possibility. In her dystopian vision, female supremacy has taken a darker turn, with women becoming the dominant force in society, using their power to control and oppress men.
It's a chilling thought. And it really forces us to consider the potential consequences of unchecked power, regardless of who holds it.
It's a reminder that the future isn't set in stone. It's shaped by the choices we make today. Riker's book, regardless of whether you agree with her conclusions, forces us to grapple with these complex questions about gender, power, and the kind of society we want to create.
Well, I think it's safe to say that this deep dive has definitely lives up to its name. We've explored some really challenging ideas, and I have a feeling this is a conversation that will stay with our listener for a while.
I agree. It's been a fascinating exploration of Riker's perspective. If you're interested in delving deeper into her arguments and forming your own conclusions, I highly recommend checking out her book, Female Supremacy: The Hijacking of Society. You can find it on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books. It's a book that will challenge your assumptions and leave you pondering the complexities of gender dynamics in today's world. Until next time, keep those brains buzzing and those critical thinking skills sharp.